There's going to be a lot of material I'm going to present today of a fairly technical nature. What are things you want to inventory in your premise environment? What are things you want to check? How do we move from your premise environment into on-demand? We're going to really fly through this. This is going to be kind of an overview to help provide you a little bit of an insight and education of what you can do to start preparing. But there's a lot more detail we can work through. So we definitely are excited that you're here, excited that you want to learn about on-demand, and we definitely want to provide you the support necessary to get you there. All right. So I won't give you the hard sales pitch on demand. I know you've heard a lot of that, but around the migration, it's easy. We've done this a ton over the past 2-3 years. We've had a countless number of clients that have moved. And everyone's migration path is a little bit different because everyone's premise environment, the functions you're doing, the objectives and business problems you're solving are a little bit different. But we do have a very proven and repeatable process to take some of the data elements, a lot of the things you've invested, a lot of time, a lot of sweat equity in building, your users, your groups, your schedules, rotations, those sorts of things, as well as a lot of the integration capabilities you have and move those over. So we've got a lot of experience doing that, and we can help bring some assistance and bring that to bear for your migration. But with that said, we really want you to think about moving to on-demand as an opportunity to review what it is that you're doing in your premise environment and what you're doing with X Matters overall. We want you to take advantage of the new capabilities. We want you to take advantage of the new technology. There's a ton of new features, a ton of new capabilities in on-demand that you've seen over the past couple days that you don't have access to. So really from a best practices perspective, what we really encourage you to do is not take the existing process you have and forklift it over and just move from premise to the cloud, but really start to take a hard look at what are you doing, what are the problems you're trying to solve, how can we enhance those processes with you, and how can we make the value increase as a result of the move. So a couple quick points. I'm sure you've seen all of these, but we hear from all of our clients essentially. The premise world is kind of drying up for them across the board. A lot of services are moving to the cloud, not just from the X Matters realm, but in a lot of different spaces. So the majority of our clients have moved and taken advantage of that. The clients we have that are left on premise, the folks here in the room, I can imagine you likely have got a lot more invested, I think, in your workflows and the processes that you've built. There may be some other gating factors or limiting factors, and that's really what we want to sit down and make sure we can help work through with you to get you there. So some of the benefits of on-demand that you don't have and that you won't get in premise, and also a lot of infrastructure types of things around voice and telephony, communications, native SMS, one-touch conference bridging, powerful new scheduling capabilities, owning the service end-to-end. These are the value proposition that we have for you waiting. So we want to help get you there. But also the capability of the integrations. We know that the value of X Matters increases for you when it's an integrated solution. And you heard a little bit yesterday with Doug and Ian about the new integration platform and new integration capabilities that we're building. And those are going to be specifically targeted to our on-demand environment. So for you to be able to take advantage of integrating to these types of systems, we need to get you to the cloud. All right, so a little bit about what is a migration. And the first thing we wanted to talk about is it's not like for like, right? These are different products. They are conceptually the same. They are solving the same business problem. But fundamentally, from an architecture perspective, from a code perspective, from a design perspective, they are vastly different. So we really encourage you to not come into this migration thinking, take what we have and again, forklift it over. We want like for like functionality. And we can do that from a requirements perspective. We can solve those same business problems in on-demand that you're solving in premise, but we're not going to do it with your premise code. And that's a really important kind of factor to come into this with. And again, we really want to use this as an opportunity for you to modernize your system. Some of our premise clients have been running since the alarm point 3 days. And there's a lot of stuff that's a little, frankly, old and crusty that we want you to kind of improve as part of this process. So what are some of the things that we can kind of take along with us from your premise environment? So things that are system-side triggers, if you've got filters, business rules, business logic in your IT management system, your incident system, your monitoring system, those are things we can easily kind of repurpose and use in on-demand. If you've got things on your integration agent, enrichment, filtering, deduplication types of activities, again, we still have that IA model in on-demand, and we can leverage a lot of those capabilities as well. And then I mentioned earlier the users, devices, groups, and schedules. That's really the crux of the value of the data you have in-prem that we can bring along to on-demand. But there's a couple of things where there's really not a good one-to-one correlation with the implementation you have in-premise, and we have new and improved solutions for message panels. The IDE that's in place right now, that's server-side scripting and subscriptions. We've got some much improved capabilities. Right? The message panels you have today, subscription panels, are JSP-based. They're code. They require developers to build, to test, to deploy. And those are what are replaced with communication plans and the form design tools. So building message panels, building subscription panels really become a drag and drop activity as opposed to a code development activity. So these are really the areas that we'd look to really try and understand what is the business process you're undertaking, what are the problems you're solving, and let's get you to take advantage of the new capabilities for those elements. Right. So the next section here and the bulk of the conversation is really going to be about trying to provide you a little bit of insight of what in your premise environment do you need to look at. How can you start to prepare for a migration, for a move to on-demand? And from the consulting team, what we would typically do with a client that would choose to come over was we would schedule what we'd call a discovery workshop with you. It's a planning and a requirements workshop, where we'd come out and we'd typically spend a day or two with you, and all the things I'm going to go through, we'd actually try and help guide you through. And in addition to just showing the bullets and the high-level types of things, we'd actually try and identify the specifics in your environment. Where are the data elements that we want to move over? Where are the processes that we recommend re-engineering? Do you have new integration opportunities? So I'm going to try and give you a little bit of a purview into what that workshop would look like, but also some specific data points for things for you to start looking at in your premise environment. And as I said, we'll make sure if you kind of fit the bill for migration, give me your card afterwards. I'll get you all this information. And also, we're always happy to do some planning calls with you and go through things a little more specific to your requirements and to your environment. So from a preparation perspective, one of the things that we found is often becomes a challenge of time or a blocker for us is around security and security process. Some clients have embraced the cloud and have a lot of services running in the cloud. Others, XMatters is their first foray into that. But regardless of where you fall on that spectrum, we often find InfoSec coming in with a lot of requests, requirements, documentation needs of show us how the data flows out of our environment and into XMatters and back in again. Tell me how your data centers are secured. Tell me about the encryption. Let's take a look at PII that you're storing, personal information you may be storing in the cloud. What type of content are you putting in these notifications now that they may be leaving our walls? Are there IP addresses? Is there password data? Is there anything confidential? So these types of security questions to ask, this is a great preparation activity for you in terms of meet with your InfoSec team, your corporate network, or your security team. Try and understand what requirements they're going to need to give you the blessing to move forward. We've done this with every client. We've got all types of white papers, security standards, types of things. We can solve these problems for you. We do so at large financial services and government entities that have some pretty stringent requirements. So I'm confident we can solve this for you. The point of this is something that can often become a gate or a blocker when you're midstream in your implementation, when some surprise InfoSec requirements pop up. So the point on this is try and identify those in advance, right? We can work through them prior to an implementation. The next point here is kind of take an inventory, right? Really, what are the problems you're looking to solve? right? How does X Matters do that for you? And how is X Matters on Demand going to do that for you in the future? Very often with premise clients, especially those that have been running for 2, 5, 10 years, have often lost sight as to why some things are configured the way they are, right? Some of these systems have been around long enough that it's kind of fallen into the category of, well, it is the way it is, that's just the way it works. So part of what we like to do as part of these workshops and part of these conversion conversations is really let's take an inventory of what is the core problem you're trying to solve. How can we solve that same problem in on-demand, but also let's look at expansion opportunities. Is there additional value we can add? While we're going through the exercise of moving, are there additional integrations that are going to give you value? Are there additional business problems that you have that you could get some benefit from X Matters from? Right? And then in terms of turning an eye towards your premise environment, this is really where the devil is in the details here, but we're really going to want to take a look at what customizations have you applied. And there's a number of areas in the product where you could have done this. So from a scripting perspective, both at the IA level as well as in that IDE level, some of those presentation or the business logic scripts. What are the users? Do you have a lot of old, crusty, unused users? Are there a lot of inactive users? What are the users and groups and user counts that you need to bring along? But also one other thing in terms of kind of moving away from premises, do you have audit or compliance retention needs for some of that data, right? A number of clients, especially in financial services, require the retention of data, especially if you're sending notification to a protected user, a compliance user. So if we're moving away from that system, this is another problem that we'd like to solve with you proactively prior to that move is what data do we need to save? How is it retained? What do we do with that data once we sunset the premise environment? Right, so I'm going to go through a couple of these categories, and then this is going to be the balance of the presentation is trying to provide you a little bit of detail and technical insight into which areas and which kind of specific items in these categories you need to look at. But as part of the move, these are the items that we really need to take a close look at is what are you doing with your integrations in your IA? Are you touching or querying or writing to or reading directly from the X Matters database? What are you doing with JSPs, both from messaging panels, subscription panels? Do you have any non-notification capabilities that you're using X Matters to essentially host? And then have you done any tweaks, customizations to things like the UI, branding, CSS, graphic treatments and logos, or custom voice recording or TTS engine types of configurations as well? Okay. So going through the checklist, we'll hit each one of those topics. But from the integrations perspective, how many? What's the type? Are you using the Java client? Are you using the integration agent? What version of an integration that we've published are you using? Is it something you've custom written? One way or two way, right? Those types of things. But also integrations in the premise world often mean more than simply taking an incident or a monitoring event out of a premise system or out of your management system and notifying it. A lot of people have instrumented integrations into X Matters to expose some X Matters data into other applications. So using a interface and remedy to find out who might be on duty. Providing a messaging panel in a third-party tool or a separate application to initiate via web services or some other mechanism, a notification to be triggered. So take a little bit of a broader view of what an integration may mean to you in your environment. And also from an instrumentation perspective, especially in the Java client or the command line call world, you may have built an integration framework, right, that you've published out, and some of our clients have lost sight or don't have insight into how many people may be leveraging that. You may have kind of published a mechanism for someone to drop an event into X Matters from various third-party applications. So the way to quickly look at that is look at how many event domains you may have in your premise environment. That's typically a good indicator to how many sets of presentation scripts and workflow scripts that you may have and how many integrations you may be supporting. From the IA side, a number of clients have taken to using the IA to perform a lot of data enrichment capabilities, right? So mentioned earlier, deduplication, content filtering or suppression, doing lookups into a CMDB, doing some additional mapping. So if you have a simple amount of information or small amount of data coming out of your management system, people use the IA as a tier to enrich that data prior to sending it into XMatters for notification. So take a look at the IA. Typically that coding may be done in JavaScript, but premise clients have done all sorts of things to using the IA as a harness. So try and do a little bit of inventory around what capabilities is your IA or your Java client, your mechanism to inject events. Likewise, some clients may not be using an IA. You may be hitting the XMatters API directly through web services calls. And this would be certainly a capability we could support in on-demand, but again, worth a conversation of in an on-demand world, the IA can also provide you some additional value in terms of security, brokering transactions from within your network to outside your network. So it's a good conversation point as well. And then lastly, we'll touch on this a few times. You'll start to hear a repeated theme, but are you using the IA or that layer for any non-notification requirements, right? For example, we've got clients that would inject an event out of a monitoring system into XMatters and notify on that event, and then use XMatters to then take that monitoring event and reach into your incident management system and create a ticket. So a lot of clients have used the IA or XMatters as glue between, as an integration tier between other products you have in your environment. So that's something we definitely want to keep a close eye on, understand the requirements around that, and how something like that would continue to be brought forward into on-demand. The database one is a big one for a lot of our premise clients. Currently in Prem, you have the database. You can, even though we don't publish the schema, you've got access to it. And a lot of clients have written custom interfaces, SQL queries, both reads and writes out of the database. And this is a primary item that you will no longer have available in the on-demand world. So if this is something you are doing in your premise environment, we really need to try and understand for what purpose? How can we solve this using web services or using the API? Do we have capabilities or functionality now introduced in on-demand which may make what you're doing redundant or no longer necessary at that point? And then again, along the similar theme, are you doing something within your XMatters environment that may not necessarily be XMatters specific? Are you hosting custom tables for some other application purposes, right? I'm sure everyone in the premise world lives this, but you've got a challenge. You're looking for somewhere to stand up a new application, new hardware. Hey, here's a SQL server. We've got plenty of table space available. Let's build it there. So trying to do, again, a little bit of an inventory of what may be attached to or touching your XMatters environment is pretty critical, so we can make sure to account for those things as part of that move. The message panels are a pretty big change for us, as mentioned before. What you've got in your premise environment is these are all JSP code. So a lot of clients have used some of our out-of-the-box, the quick message panel, and use that for simple ad hoc messages. But others have really built some complex code in their message panels using JSP. You may have dynamic data that's looked up. You may query a database. You may query a CMDB. You may have some hierarchical data relationships. So you're providing someone a pretty rich interface to construct an ad hoc notification. We can absolutely build those capabilities in our communication plans and our form designer in on-demand, even including reaching into your environment. You can publish a web service. We can query for data that you may be storing in another information. So we've got a lot of dynamic capabilities, but this is where one of the big changes will come through is we're not going to pick up your JSP message panels with that code as is. So trying to understand what's the business purpose for your message panels, what is the workflow that happens, where is the data sourced from, are they on the simple end or are they on the more complex end? And this is an area of focus for us. So trying to get an inventory from your perspective of the message panels, what they're trying to accomplish is going to be a critical component. Okay. From a subscriptions perspective, another thing very similar to the message panels, your subscription panels are also based on that JSP model. So similar to those messaging panels, we're going to want to kind of reconstitute those into communication plans. So one of the big things that we've often found is people have been relying on subscriptions as a primary targeting mechanism, as opposed to more of a find and assign notification targeting mechanism. So one of the things we want you to kind of take a look at and think about from a subscriptions perspective is we've got opportunities to, I think, help improve the process, right? A lot of targeting via subscription is often a spray and pray type of approach and can result in a lot of over notifications. So this is an area that we think is ripe for taking a look at what that process is and seeing if we can improve your subscription model as we move into on-demand. Right? Voice and other configurations are another consideration as well. We found not all of our premise clients have implemented voice communications, and conference bridging, primarily because you needed to own that infrastructure. You had to plug in dialogic cards, you had to do SIP networking, you had to get your telephony people to give you all that the bandwidth that was necessary, and a lot of these configurations were not for the faint of heart. So the folks in the room running prem voice may or may not be a concern for you from a migration perspective. Obviously, one of the benefits of going into on-demand is that voice and telephony and infrastructure is just there for the taking. But from a migration perspective, do you have custom TTS libraries, text-to-speech? Do you have custom voice recordings? Those are things that we can work with you and bring along, but our voice infrastructure, I think, by definition, will be different than your SIP environment or your dialogic card environment. So trying to understand how you're utilizing voice, how you've customized your voice capabilities as well. There's a number of clients that have also used xMatters as an inbound IVR, right? So understanding if you've used it in that capability, again, for what business purpose, what requirements, is going to be key to helping find success there. But then a lot of other types of things you may have done around the UI, logos, CSS, branding of not only the notifications themselves, but also of the xMatters UI. We want to make sure we can understand. Authentication is a big one. A lot of people will use native authentication on-prem, so you're storing your username and password in xMatters. But a healthy dose are also using LDAP. In on-demand, unless you're publishing your LDAP publicly, which is not a typical mechanism, LDAP won't be an authentication method for you in on-demand. But we have embraced a SAML SSO infrastructure, which has become a standard for cloud-based authentication. So we want to try and understand if you've got LDAP markers in your user IDs and make sure we can account for those. And then lastly, and this is kind of the potpourri category of things, the roles and functions. What are the roles you've created? Are there parent and children roles that inherit properties? How have you sliced and diced your users according to those roles? We've got a very powerful, very similar to Premise, a very powerful roles capability and roles creation. Obviously, we need to understand what the requirements are, the purpose of those roles, how you're using them, and we can get those roles re-instrumented. All right. So the next section, we want to talk a little bit about what is a recommended process. How do we go from A to B, and how do we get there, and what are the steps involved? So from a consultative perspective, we really recommend taking a phased approach. Our kind of philosophy here is we'd like, the term I use is we want to speed time to value. When you get an xMatters on-demand subscription, we'd like you to be able to take advantage of it immediately. Often a migration activity in terms of moving your IAs, touching your incident management system, going through those InfoSec and security processes, those can be long poles in a project tent and can add a lot of time. But there's a ton of value you can get from on-demand on day one of the subscription. You've got conference bridging immediately available. You've got native SMS. You've got the voice capabilities. You've got a lot of ad hoc messaging and the ability to create more communication plans and forms. So our approach is to try and take a phased approach where we'd like you to be able to get value from X Matters On Demand the day you turn it on. So in kind of preparation for our migration, we want you to start thinking about what are some use cases that maybe we're doing in premise, maybe we're not doing today, but how can we start using on demand quickly? So this may be things like major incident management, executive communications, business or application holder stakeholder communications, ad hoc messaging. There's a ton of power in those communication plans. We'd like you to be able to start using those without the full migration becoming gating. And then as a later phase, or as rather as the next phase, is let's start moving and the mechanical aspects of extracting data from premise, repointing or migrating the integrations if there's a data synchronization in place. So we really want you to start thinking about this migration not as a big bang approach, but as an iterative or as an evolution type of process to get there. So a little bit more insight into, well, what does that migration plan look like and what does that implementation plan look like? So what's not shown here is all of the pre-work we've talked about, right? In terms of sitting down with you, trying to understand a little bit more detail of your specific requirements, and really trying to come up with an overall strategy and plan specific to what you may have configured in your premise environment. But kind of moving from the preparatory phase to the implementation phase, first step is we will provision your on-demand environment on day one. And then we will, all of our on-demand clients have gone through this, but we'll go through an onboarding and training process with you. What that is we like to start immediately, and we typically will do a couple of sessions with you in terms of doing some specific configurations for your environment. What are your sites? What are your time zones? What are those sorts of kind of baseline configurations? But also a lot of administrative type of training. Here's an overview of the environment. Let's give you some training on the communication plans. Let's show you how to load users. Let's show you how to run reports. All of those kinds of things that you may be conceptually familiar with from premise, but mechanically unfamiliar with on-demand. We get to you straight away. And then that, as I mentioned, that first value, that phase one launch, we do believe, and we've got a ton of clients who have gotten value from this approach, is we are looking for ways to get you that value quickly. So we try to strive for this plan to find that, to help find that use case, and to kind of plan our onboarding and structure our onboarding and training around that. So we like to get you that production capability as quickly as we can. And following that, that's when we'll come out and perform more of that migration workshop of, okay, now that we've gotten you a use case, you're up and running, you're using it, you're getting familiar with the environment, you're communicating out to your users around some of the changes. Let's come in and do some process re-engineering with you and some planning around the mechanics in your premise environment. Let's take a look at the integrations. Let's take a look at your data synchronization. Let's try and look at priorities, right, in terms of what you have versus new opportunities for expansion as well. So following that workshop is where we'll sit down with you and come up with the plan, right? What resources and timeframes do we need from your team? How can X Matters help contribute from a consulting perspective to get you there? And then let's build an implementation plan. One of the elements that you would expect but may not have been familiar with in kind of the workings of the premises is a data extraction process. Using some of our tools that we have, Pentaho and Epic, this is where we'll actually be able to extract from your premise environment users, groups, devices, schedules, that type of data. We can kind of go through a migration activity and a little bit of a processing or ETL change to bring that data into on-demand. So one of the things to think about is from the kind of that phase two process is the life cycle that you're going to have with your premise environment and how it will overlap or coincide with on-demand. That's one of the kind of trickier things from a planning perspective is you're still running, you're live, you're off and running, and you've got critical events flowing through your premise environment. At some point, we are going to want to take a snapshot of that data, of the users and groups, schedules, et cetera, and bring that into into on-demand with you. So trying to understand what are your needs in terms of running in parallel with your premise environment, to kind of keep those notification lights on and running while some of those migration and testing activities are taking place. So that's kind of a key component to the planning and the workshop and kind of the scheduling of these types of things. Obviously leading towards the UAT and leading towards what we call a phase 2 launch is kind of the new world order, if you will, of your integrations, your data into on-demand. But a few points here is from our perspective, we're not looking at phase 2 as the end of the road with you, right? That may be the end of the migration activities. That may constitute the point where we've got your premise data into on-demand. We've reconstructed your message panels and your subscriptions and the integrations you've had in place or new ones that you've identified. But as you've heard over the past couple days, the product that we have in on-demand is moving quickly. There are constantly new features and capabilities coming out with our quarterly releases. So one of the things that we have in our on-demand world that you don't really have access to in premise is the notion of what we call a client success manager. The client success manager works with all of our on-demand clients and is someone that you can rely on to help keep you informed of what are the new product capabilities, how they have a good understanding of your business drivers and what's important to you, and they can help have some value-added conversations with you to help map new product features and capabilities to where your business drivers and where your needs are and things that you may be able to take advantage of. So, again, we don't look at this kind of endpoint here as the overall endpoint with you, but it's really the starting point with you in on-demand. And ideally, we'd like you to continue to take advantage of that new functionality as it comes out. Right. So one of the things I had intended to do with the balance of the time is actually use this as a little bit of Q&A time for those clients that do have premise environments. Happy to get into whatever details, questions you may have around your specific environments, questions you may have around the integrations, try and help give you a little bit of insight into planning. What I'm happy to do is we can certainly do it in the main tent, but if maybe Troy, I'd defer to you. If we'd like to accelerate it, I can also go off into it. If people are interested specifically from Prem, we can spend the next 30 minutes at a round table or also at lunch and get into some specific areas of your environment you may like some help with planning.
A couple questions.
Yep.
And then we can table the rest for.
Okay. Any questions, comments? Yeah.
Having just migrated out of 4.1
Yep.
into 5.1, I'm assuming you're going to have something like that migration tool that you did from 4.1 to 5.1 in this type of environment, or am I thinking differently?
Conceptually, yes. Mechanically, it's going to be a little bit different. The migration tool from premise to move data from 4 to 4.1 to 5 to 5.1, et cetera. Essentially, since the schema is not published, and the schema may change from version to version, what that tool will do is it will extract your data, we'll do a little recombobulation into the new schema and insert it back in. So from a conceptual perspective, we're doing the same thing, but the scope of what we're doing is much more narrow. There's a ton of configuration information, your protocol providers, your database settings, all of those types of things that live in your database. A lot of those data points come with that migration from 4 to 4.1, et cetera. We're not concerned about taking a lot of that data out. So the scope of what we take out of your premise environment is a little more narrow. We don't care about protocol providers. We don't care about configuration information. We're also not taking event and audit data as well, the event history, which is why I noted before if you have compliance requirements, that's a critical thing for us to know so we can make sure to retain that data. What our migration process is really focused on is the users, the groups, the devices, and the schedules or rotations. That's really the actionable data that we're going to take into on-demand. So from the data extraction process, we will query your database. We will extract those elements. We will kind of recombobulate them and insert them into, using web services into on-demand. but a lot of that configuration information is left behind. Great. Anyone else? See.
So going from on-premise to the cloud, obviously you're going out into a public environment. Are there additional encryption capabilities in the cloud-based solution for PII and just all the data in general?
Yeah. So from a there's a level of I guess security. I wouldn't just leave it at encryption of all of the data in on-demand, not simply user data, but all of the data. One of the things to think about, though, is I'm less concerned with security and encryption of the whole workflow of extracting data for your environment, both from a one-time migration perspective as well as a ongoing, let's take an event out of your incident management system and bring it, right? That's going to be secured through that data path through the IA. It will be secured in transit. It will be secured at rest, right? So we can provide you all the security documentation you need, but from an overall workflow perspective, everything's going to be secured and encrypted appropriately. But the thing you didn't ask, but the thing to think about, and why this is a little bit of a change in on-demand, is oftentimes premise clients are just using, say, email notifications or even voice notifications. All that data resides in your network, right? So it's initiated from your network. It is XMatters is in your network. Notifications stay in your network, right? That information that lives in the notifications never leaves your four walls. And that's something that does change in on-demand. So even though we are securing all the information between your systems and XMatters, once we are going to send a notification to you or to your users, we're going to do so through our telephony providers, our email providers, the public SMS gateways, right? Those types of things. So the data that lives in the notifications themselves can't be encrypted, right? Because you're going to need your users to be able to read it and access it. So some financial services clients have realized that a lot of the information that they're passing in their notifications could be considered confidential, could be security, IP addresses of servers, those sorts of things. So kind of the process to work through is try and take a look at what information are you sending in your notifications and run that through your InfoSec team, right? Is that allowable to send through public SMS, public email channels, right? Because we're now communicating from outside your network back in. That's, I think, where the consideration should be if there's a security concern. I mean, in our experience, for the most part, information that lives in tickets, I think most clients have pretty good processes around not putting in passwords, right, stored in tickets, confidential information, right? It's a little more, this server, this application is experiencing an outage, those sorts of things. But some clients do look at that as potentially a risk, right, of you're essentially sending data out that we have an issue on this IP, on this application. So there's a balance point, right? You need your notifications to have enough information and value so they're actionable for your end users, and you need to weigh that against the data that you put into it.
Okay, so for the cloud solution, is everything encrypted at your database level?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Everything, as again in transit and in rest, is secured and encrypted.
All right, great, thanks.
Anyone else? Good. All right. Well, I appreciate the time. As I said, we are very interested in spending more time with you, kind of specific to your environment and premise. So please feel free to find me, give me your card. I'm happy to schedule some more time with you, and we can go through things from your environment in a little more specific detail to you.
Thanks, Jonathan.